Another way of saying very. For very wide, you can use expansive. For very willing, you may use eager. Instead of very windy, you can say blustery. For very worried, you may say distressed. Very wise, you can use sage. For very bright, you can say luminous. Very busy, you can say swamped. Very careful, you can say cautious. Very clear, you can say obvious. Very colorful, you can say vibrant. Instead of saying very confused, you may say perplexed. For very great, you may say terrific. Instead of saying very friendly, you may say amiable. Very glad, you may say overjoyed. Very great, you may say terrific. Instead of saying very angry, you can say furious. Very beautiful, you can say gorgeous. Very big, you can say massive. Very boring, you can say dull. Instead of saying very noisy, you can say deafening. Instead of saying very poor, you can say destitute. Very cheap, you can say stingy. Instead of saying very clean, you can say spotless. Instead of saying very short, you can say brief. Very difficult, you can say arduous. Instead of saying very dry, you can say arid. Instead of very quick, you can say rapid. Very bad, you can say awful. Instead of saying very smart, you can say intelligent. Instead of saying very sad, you can say sorrowful. Instead of very upset, you can say distraught. Instead of very cold, you can say freezing. Instead of very strong, you can say forceful. Very huge, you can say colossal. Very calm, you can say serene. Instead of very ugly, you can say hideous. Very small, you can say petite. Very funny, you can say hilarious. Instead of very quiet, you can say this hushed. Instead of very rich, you can say wealthy. Very expensive, you can say costly. Very dirty, you can say filthy. Very tall, you can say towering. Instead of saying very easy, you can say effortless. Instead of very wet, you can say soak. Instead of very slow, you can say sluggish. Instead of saying very good, you can say excellent. Instead of very stupid, you can say idiotic. Instead of very happy, you can say ecstatic. For very exciting, you can say exhilarating. Very warm, you can say hot. For very weak, you can say frail. Very little, you can say tiny. For very creative, you can say innovative. Very crowded, you can say bustling. Very deep, you may say profound. Very empty, you may say desolate. Very excited, you may say thrilled. Very fancy, you may say lavish. For very fat, you may say obese. For very heavy, you may say laden. Very hungry, you may say starving. Instead of very hurt, you may say battered. Instead of saying very large, you can say huge. For very lazy, you may say indolent. Very long, you may say extensive. Very loose, you may say slack. Very accurate, you may say exact. Instead of saying very messy, you can say slovenly. Very nice, you can say kind. Very often, you can say frequently. Very old, you may say ancient. Very open, you can say transparent. Instead of saying very afraid, you may say fearful. Instead of saying very clever, you may say intelligent. Very cute, you can say adorable. Very tall, that would be tedious. Very eager, you can say keen. Very evil, you can say wicked. For very fast, you can say quick. Very fierce, you can say ferocious. Very light, you can say luminous. Very lively, you can say animated. Very lovely, you can say adorable. Very mean, you can say cruel. Instead of saying very pale, you can say ashen. Instead of very perfect, you may say flawless. Instead of very powerful, you can say compelling. For very pretty, you can say beautiful. For very rainy, you can say pouring. Instead of saying very scared, you can say petrified. Very scary, you can say chilling. For very serious, you can say grave. For very sharp, you can say keen. For very shiny, you can say gleaming. For very shy, you can say timid. Instead of very simple, you can say basic. Instead of very skinny, you may say skeletal. For very smooth, you can say sleek. For very sorry, you may say apologetic. For very special, you can say exceptional. For very sure, you can say certain. Very sweet, you may use thoughtful. Instead of saying very talented, you can say gifted. Instead of very tasty, you may use delicious. For very thirsty, you can say parched. For very tight, you can use constricting. Instead of very tiny, you can use minuscule. Instead of very tired, you can use exhausted.